This is Duke University.
Could grab your seats.
I'm sure panelists will make their way up here. I'm going to talk for a couple minutes anyway, so it'll be fine.
Our panelists, a couple of our panelists are still making their way in. What I'd like to do is introduce to you Professor David Schanzer. You heard him ask a question in the last panel. David's an associate professor of the practice at Duke University. He's not in the law school, but he's across the street in the Sanford School. But probably equally or even more important, he's the director of the Triangle Center on Terrorism and Homeland Security, and that's a research consortium between Duke, UNC Chapel Hill, and RTI International. David also is a lawyer. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School, and where he was editor of the Law Review, which I am very impressed with, David.
An editor, not the
A little puffery is not wrong.
President Obama was the editor.
Which tells you a lot of things right there. But we're really privileged to have him, and he will introduce his panel, but I think he has a couple of introductory remarks, and what I want to do is also bring up his slides. Let's see how clever the old general is. Damn, I am good so far. How do you like that?
Right.
We have the technology.
Thank you, Charlie, and thank you to the panelists who I'll introduce shortly. This is a great conference every year, and it was when Scott was running things, and of course Charlie's taken up a fine tradition, and I'm honored to be here. The main reason to put these slides up was to ensure that you didn't look at a picture of me for an hour and a half. But what I wanted to do is, before diving into things, is just to frame this issue a little bit for us. These are 6 American citizens, all of whom either plotted or engaged in some sort of what I would call al-Qaeda-inspired violence, either inside the United States or outside the United States. And I guess the first point I would make by looking at these pictures, you'll recognize some of them. Some of them are not with us any longer. I think all the rest are in jail. Racial profiling is not going to solve this problem for you, as you can see by this set of pictures. But in any event, our topic for today is countering homegrown violent extremism. And our question that I've posed to the panelists is, what ought the government to do about this problem? And what I'd like to do in framing the issue is to place it in some context, because there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of kind of about the nature of this problem, and I'd like to try to bring some facts to bear before we dive into things. Immediately following 9/11, there was a sense that there was a large network of either foreign nationals who had infiltrated the United States and who were planning on engaging in some levels of violence inspired by the 9/11 attack, or American citizens as well who were loyal to this concept. And our initial reactions were what's called the Pent bomb, short for the 9/11 attacks investigation, where we rounded up 1,200, and what I call the NSEERS program. I don't remember what the acronym is, but it is a program that required foreign nationals who were lawfully inside the United States to register, special registration, people whose country of origin were 20 what we call high risk, and it was all Muslim majority countries, to do special registration and actually additional interviews and things of that nature. And these were, and the Pent bomb investigation were, I think, 1,200 Muslims, American Muslims, or not American Muslims, but Muslims in America were rounded up, detained, most of them on some level of immigration charges. No one was ever charged with a terrorism incident coming out of that investigation. Many of those people were deported. Some were released. But we had a very rough initial response, which were, you know, there's no other way to say it. They did have elements of discrimination and profiling in them. Whoops. How do I go?
Just hand it to me.
I thought, there we go. Then there was the notion that we would have, there was a network of sleeper cells within the United States that we had to uncover. That foreign nationals who had infiltrated. This is just a slide from a television show that lasted only 18 episodes. But that was the big fear. But it turned out that there really, we didn't find sleeper cells. We had Mr. Almari who was here. We had the gentleman from Minnesota who only wanted to learn how to land planes, whose name is escaping me at the moment. But other than that, we did not find, quote, sleeper cells inside the United States. But that didn't stop individuals like Steve Emerson and many of his ilk from perpetuating. Whoop, I'm not going to be Rudy Giuliani and answer this call, even though it's probably from my wife. Thank you. From perpetuating this, what I would say was a myth that was perpetrated for ideological and political purposes, that there was an organized, systematic network of terrorists and terrorist organizations among Muslims, Muslim foreign nationals, Muslim Americans, that large-scale organizations had presences inside the United States, spanning across the country. And while there were, certainly there are incidences of individuals who spoke and support and things like that, this notion, again, was untrue, has never been proven, and there were no actions taken that could really have proven it. So some colleagues and I, starting in 2007, set out for the first time to try to document what truly is the extent of our homegrown radicalization or our homegrown violent extremism problem. Of course, the terminology has evolved over the years. Our first report came out in 2009, but we have then updated them for 2010 and 2011. And basically what we have found is if you include all the individuals who have been arrested for a terrorism-related incident involving some aspect of violence, so this does not include people who wrote a check to Hamas, or they joined a foreign fighting force, or they successfully engaged in attack, and the numbers of those are very small. But we're looking at about 200 in that category, about 200 individuals over the course of 10 years. So we're talking about 20 individuals on average per year. And just to put that in a little bit of context, if you look at the FBI crime reports, we have about 15,000 murders in the United States annually. Now, I'm not saying that if these 20 individuals per year had been successful in their plots, that it wouldn't have been a large-scale problem or crisis, but I think we have to place it in, use something to place this concept in some sort of context in terms of the magnitude of the social problem that we're facing. And let me just sketch what I think have been 3 different phases since 9/11. And from 2003 to 2008, I would call the early stage disruption cases, where the government was, with any whiff of individuals who were espousing or taking any sort of action that were of some sort of affiliation with a radical ideology were going very early into arrests using whatever tools were available to them. And it made some of the trials quite difficult. Matter of fact, in the Liberty City case, we had some acquittals. We had one person who was retried 3 times. That was the case with the alleged plot to bomb the Sears Tower. And it's interesting that we had these kind of large groups of individuals during that time that were being rounded up. Now, most of them ended up in successful prosecutions, mostly under material support for terrorism. But up till 2008, our database showed 98 people. 44 of them were in these groups. The cases, by and large, were difficult to prove. They were a bit on the tenuous side, and because of the tenuousness, they did undermine, I think, some of the, within the Muslim American community, a notion that are people being rounded up for their ideas or for their actions. And hardly any of the individuals had demonstrated a longstanding affiliation with an organized terrorist group. And we have this one case, of course, in Detroit, where a prosecution, an indictment was brought against 5 individuals, and ultimately the prosecutor had engaged in such misconduct that he was eventually, the cases had to be dismissed, and he was eventually prosecuted, although for failing to give up exculpatory evidence, and although he was eventually acquitted as well. So this was what was happening to 2008. And you'll notice in the blue in this graph are cases that we identify that were disrupted at a very early level. The red are later disruptions, and the gray would represent either when actions of violence actually took place or individuals left the United States to join a foreign fighting force. We considered that akin to an attack. And that's actually a lot of the grays are individuals who left to join al-Shabaab or do something outside the United States. So the next phase was this spike in 2009. And this is when our report was getting ready to come out. So we kept having to change everything as we were drafting it. But we had the almost the 20 young men from Minneapolis who went to Somalia to join al-Shabaab. We had the Zazi case, which really was a serious case, an individual who had bomb-making materials. Fortunately, he wasn't very good at putting them together. But he did travel to New York and was eventually apprehended. And of course, we had the terrible incident at Fort Hood where 13 people were killed by Nidal Hassan. So at this stage, our leaders were saying homegrown terrorism and al-Qaeda abroad on the decline, but they said this is our gravest threat. This is it's very difficult to find these individuals. They don't leave a lot of footprints. They have, obviously, as Hassan did, the potential to cause great domestic disruption. And the question in 2009, which was posed to me, is this an inexorable development that is going to lead to more and more domestic homegrown terrorism? And at the time, and you can look this up, I said, it's too early to tell. We really don't know if this is an aberration or a trend. And fortunately, from my perspective, and also for the country, we've actually seen some pretty strong declines from 2009 in the last 2 years. 2012 so far hasn't hit the 10 mark, and we're at least a third of the way through, so we'll see what happens there. But I would call the 2010, 2011 what I would call more of the lone wolf period, and that's demonstrated by the incidents down to about their normal average of about 20 individuals per year in the last 2 years. The seriousness has declined from 2009, certainly. 19 of the 20 incidents in 2011 were disrupted before there was any sort of acts of violence. The capabilities of these individuals have seemed very low. And a lack of real connection with international terrorist organizations, which is what can ramp up their capabilities. And very few had these connections to the foreign fighting groups, outside groups. And the two exceptions in 2011, of course, was the Times Square bomber who did travel to Afghanistan, got some training, and then unsuccessfully tried to blow up a car in Times Square. And then we have on our list the Iranian case, because they were Muslims, they were living in the United States, they were not necessarily al-Qaeda inspired, but they were Muslims nonetheless, who did have, obviously, allegedly, connections to the Iranian government. So just two words before we get to our panelists. So what are our models for countering violent extremism? One I would call the kind of intelligence / law enforcement, the merger of those concepts to deal with domestic incidents, which from using the tools of intelligence, of surveillance, data collection, surveillance with intelligence authorities, not criminal law authorities, fusing things to try to identify trends, patterns, and of course information from human sources. When you can get enough evidence, suspicion to get into a law enforcement context, the use of confidential informants, criminal authority surveillance to eventually bring a criminal arrest. And of course, that's been subject of great controversy, the NYPD discussion relating to their surveillance of communities outside of their jurisdiction and of student associations and universities also outside their jurisdiction is really part and parcel of this law enforcement intelligence model. And it brings up a lot of the issues I'm sure our panelists are going to discuss. And then my colleague Deborah Ramirez, I know, is going to talk of more of a community policing model, which is more based on developing a trusted relationship, problem solving within the community to address both counterterrorism and other issues, but with the hopeful benefit of working with the community to develop, identify possible violent extremist issues even before it reaches any sort of criminal activity. And so I think you can maybe keep these models in mind as our speakers. The Obama administration in August 2011 has weighed in really on the side, although it's engaged every day in the intelligence / law enforcement model, at least as a matter of policy and strategy, has weighed in that we ought to try to develop the community policing model for dealing with this problem. And it issued a strategy in August of 2011, which you can look up on the internet, and then an implementation plan in December of the same year. And so that brings us to our panelists. So I hope that puts it in context. Their biographies are in the pamphlet, so I'm not going to go into great detail. Deborah Ramirez is a professor of law at Northeastern University. She's going to speak first. And Sahar Aziz has recently left the Department of Homeland Security and now is at Texas Wesleyan. And we have our own Margaret here from the Duke Law School. So I believe it's going to be Deborah, Sahar, and then Margaret. Thank you for the panelists. I'm going to turn it over to you, Deborah. You don't have slides, right? No.
No slides, people.
Okay, I wanted to thank, obviously, Duke University School of Law, David for beginning the panel and setting the stage for us, Professor Dunlap for organizing this, and the Center for Law, Ethics, and National Security for hosting this important conference and for inviting me to participate this morning. Now, I know that we began, and I know many of you are concerned with international incidents, but I think there is an intersection with domestic security, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. Now, as David has indicated, recently, in August of 2011, President Obama issued a very important policy statement. So for those of us who are working on thwarting domestic violent extremism, this was an important moment in America because his policy paper declared that in the future, our strategy for preventing violent extremism would in part be to create and empower local partnerships between law enforcement and the Arab and Muslim communities in the United States. Now, part of this was a recognition of the homegrown terrorism threat and an indication that our best defense against that threat would be well-informed and engaged local communities. This community engagement model envisions the following: that law enforcement is going to sit down at the table on a regular basis, not just in response to an event, but every single month, and work with the Arab and Muslim communities to engage in problem solving, to engage in discussions, to resolve issues, and to develop the most effective collaborative strategies to thwart hate crimes and violent extremism. So we are in a period of transition in which we are beginning this new national community engagement strategy. The paper that David showed you was followed with an implementation plan, and we are in the process of implementing it. I want to focus for this audience on the benefits of this strategy. Why are we doing this at this moment? I think there are benefits both for law enforcement and for the community. So since 9/11, we have learned that community input and assistance is critical to counterterrorism investigations. As all of you know, terrorism investigations focus on information, getting the right information, getting it quickly, and the nuanced analysis of the information. Now, since the goal of every CT investigation is to prevent, detect, and deter violent extremism before it occurs, reliable and credible intelligence is essential to our success. And one important source of intelligence is community tips, community information. This community engagement model allows law enforcement to develop bridges of trust and bridges of communication with community members. They are the experts. They do know, as you know, what's out of place in their community. And in addition, they possess the cultural, linguistic, and religious expertise needed for accurate and meaningful analysis of new and existing intelligence. Thus, the best way to obtain the community information that we need to thwart violent extremism is through this engagement model. Now, I want to tell two stories because, and they're anecdotal, but there is more data, and David has more quantitative data about this phenomenon. The strategy's benefits can and should be measured in terrorist attacks averted and in lives saved. So I want to tell you a story about how the model worked in the UK, and then another story about how it worked here, and then talk about what we need to harness the full strength of this model. So I'm going to start in the UK. In 2008, in Bristol, there was a mosque, and the mosque members one evening saw one of their other members, Isa Ibrahim. And when they saw him, they looked at his hands, and his hands were burnt and cut, and they said, "What happened?" And he said, "I am on a fight against the UK and America. I'm doing bomb-making activity. I'm going to create a suicide vest, and I'm going to use it to blow up a local shopping center." Now, they were horrified. So the first thing they did was to try to talk him out of it, to say this is contrary to everything about Islam. This is not part of our religion. This is not a part of who we are or who we want to be. You cannot do this. There are other ways to express yourself. Let us help you find ways to express your dissatisfaction and your anger that don't involve violence. But he would not be dissuaded. They said, "Can we go to your apartment and clean out all the bomb-making equipment? Can you begin to have a dialogue? Can you wait?" Nothing worked. And so finally, they did go to a local engagement officer. They explained what I explained to you, and that night the engagement officer got a search warrant for Isa Ibrahim's apartment. There was bomb-making equipment there. There was all kinds of incriminating evidence, and he was arrested and he was convicted. Now, one of the most important aspects of this is how the police handled this after the arrest and conviction. And they were champions for this community. They publicly acknowledged the important role that this community played in alerting them to activities that they said would have been particularly difficult for them to detect because he was acting alone. This is the lone wolf that David was referring to. And then, quote, they said, all of Bristol should be grateful to these communities for providing information. Without a doubt, they save people from serious injury and worse. The next story that I want to tell you about how this model should work comes from the United States. Now, I don't know how many of you heard about this case. 5 men, young men, from the Washington, D.C. area go to Pakistan. The community gives a tip to the FBI, and the FBI intervenes. Within the Beltway, this is called the Five Guys case. From December of 2009. Have some of you heard about this? No, yes? All right. So I wanted to learn more about exactly how this worked. So I was with Nahad Awad, who is the National Executive Director of CARE. Now, CARE is the Council on American Islamic Relations. It's one of the largest grassroots Islamic organizations in the country. So I've been working with CARE since right after 9/11. And I said, you know, I want to know more about down in the weeds, what happened? How did the community get this information? Where did they go? How did it get to the FBI? Because we're trying to create a clear path for community information to get to the right source. So tell me what happened. He said, well, you've come to the right person because I'm the one who contacted the FBI. I said, well, good. Nahad, tell me what happened. He said, it was the weekend, it was night. Families came to me, families who know me, who've known me for a long time, and who've been part of CARE. And they were shocked to find that in the bedrooms of their sons was all this literature, extremist literature, and letters saying that they were joining the fight against America and they were not coming home. The parents said they left these tapes, and we've played them, and they're awful, they're terrible. It says all this extremist stuff. What are we going to do? We want them back. And Nahad said to them, you don't have any good choices right now as parents. But if these were my sons, the only organization that can keep them alive right now is the FBI. You've got to go to the FBI. Now, they did not want to go to the FBI. They did not want to go to law enforcement. They assumed that Nahad, as the executive director of CARE, could somehow take care of this for them, with his Pakistani contacts or something. And there are deep-seated fears in the Arab, Muslim, and Sikh community against going to law enforcement. They haven't had a lot of positive contact. Some of it's negative, and some of it has nothing to do with the U.S. It has to do with their life before, and relatives before, and stories about the police. They do not think of the police as officer-friendly, and they do not think of the police as their friends. So this is something that we have to deal with through training and through this model. Nahad finally convinced them by getting a lawyer to come in the room and talk to them about their options that they did need to do this. And then he said, I called the switchboard of the FBI, but I speak with a heavy accent, and I was not sure they would take me seriously, and they just took the message. I said, what'd you do? He said, I realized that in Houston, CARE had an excellent relationship with the FBI, and that there were CARE members there. So I called everyone, I emailed everyone as fast as I could, and I said, right now I need the cell phone number of an FBI agent. And they got one. And they got to the FBI, and this tip led to the arrest of the young men in Pakistan and probably spared both their lives as well as the lives of US and Pakistani soldiers. Now, because this community information can thwart terrorist threats, this model needs to become part, not the whole thing, but part of our counterterrorism strategy. The problem is this, though. The problem is in Nahad's story. In the United States today, the few community law enforcement partnerships that we have that are focused on preventing terrorism, preventing violent extremism, preventing hate crimes, working collaboratively, meeting regularly, and not just in an emergency situation and not just once, exchanging information so that there are clear channels of communication. Those models that we have are all operating independently of each other. We do not have any central coordination or collaborative structure. There are no national programs to provide the training, protocols, tools, templates, and research necessary to demonstrate how to begin to nurture, strengthen, and make these models successful. Nor is there a central clearinghouse for information about such efforts, which, if we had it, would disseminate things like promising practices, best practices, lessons learned, successes, what failures have we had, what can we learn from those failures, and what's happening in the UK with their prevent strategy. To what extent has that given us some best practices or promising practices? To what extent do the pre-9/11 community policing models help us here in this new context? And when I'm talking about a national structure, I do not mean the police training the police on how to deal with the community. I mean a structure that's focused on training both the community and the police about how to work collaboratively, train collaboratively, problem solve collaboratively, and create strategies collaboratively. And the community will not just come to the table. They have to have a neutral place, probably an academic setting, where they feel that the table is not totally controlled by law enforcement. After President Obama's policy statement, the challenge to all of us is this: do we have the will and the capacity to design a coordinated national infrastructure to support and nourish these efforts? A place where community members can feel safe, will want to come, can ask their questions, can get trained, can learn successful models for how this partnership can work to benefit them and their interests, as well as law enforcement, which obviously has to be at the table and trained as well. Now, while it may be obvious that this community engagement strategy is beneficial to law enforcement, I also believe it benefits the community. First, these partnerships can help ensure that whatever counterterrorism strategies are implemented in those communities, that the damage to those communities will be mitigated by strategies which by their very nature are intrusive. The community has to be knowledgeable about what's happening to the extent they can be, and they have to be part of a collaborative implementation strategy in terms of how to get the information law enforcement needs. Second, these communities are very vulnerable, and they need law enforcement partnerships that are going to guarantee them the effective investigation and prosecution of hate crimes and hate incidents that continue to plague these communities in unprecedented numbers. You need only read the papers to know that since 9/11, members of the Arab, Muslim, and Sikh community have been victims of discrimination, of hate crimes, of hate incidents. These have occurred in airports, they've occurred in schools, they've occurred in public places, sometimes, unfortunately, at the hands of the police, sometimes, unfortunately, at the hands of government workers. And communities that have an ongoing relationship with law enforcement are more likely to obtain swift, effective, and appropriate responses to these kinds of incidents. Finally, this model presents an opportunity to the community to affirm their willingness to actively participate in homeland security efforts, which they are doing, by the way, and in turn, to help them debunk the negative stereotypes, because they are losing the war in the arena of public opinion. It also allows the police to become champions of the community by publicly standing with them and telling the public that these community members are important partners and that they're needed to combat violent extremism. Law officers can and should say, these community members are not suspects. They are partners, and they play an important role in keeping our homeland safe. And those words will resonate with the public because they are spoken by law enforcement. Thus, I believe we stand a greater chance of conducting rational, well-reasoned, and thoughtful counterterrorism, civil rights, and counterintelligence investigations when we have long-lasting and trusting relationships with the community.
Thank you, Debbie, for your passion and your excellent presentation. Sahar?
I do.
Let's see. Does that look like it? Why did I even doubt myself?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's good to see such a diverse audience. I see members of the military and also domestic law enforcement and members of the public. So I'm looking forward to having an engaging conversation. I included my Twitter account because it seems my students have taught me that everything can be done in 140 words. So I said, okay. So now I send them little messages about reminding them to study. Remember to put in your 3 hours to 1 hour today.
I'm taking a note on that.
Anything to motivate them. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking obviously about homegrown terrorism, and I'm going to be focusing more from the perspective of the communities. Before I went to DHS, I was an advocate for many Muslim civil rights organizations, and I was also a member of the community outreach group in the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. So I've kind of seen this from various angles. Oops. Oh, I'm doing the same thing you did.
Right
there we go. Okay, so these are the main points that I'd like to make today. The first is there is obviously an exclusive focus on Muslims with regard to homegrown terrorism. Now, we all know homegrown terrorism predated 9/11. Before then, people used to think of the Ku Klux Klan or other white supremacist groups. Maybe they would think of the Unabomber. They would think of Timothy McVeigh. So there were, there's all kinds of terrorists. That goes without saying. And that ultimately keeps us less safe. And I'll talk a little bit about the case in Georgia where there were 4 Anglo 60 years and older, it was an interesting demographic, who attempted to bomb an IRS building, a justice building, and other government buildings. And it was a pretty, I don't know how advanced of a plot it was, but it was in full swing. And fortunately, law enforcement stopped it. And then ultimately, it has a very adverse impact on these communities. These are not abstract issues for them. These are not this is not race baiting. This is not whining and complaining and playing a victim mentality. These are people's lives being affected in very palpable ways adversely. And I'll go into more detail. And the third, which is a bit of it's not a critique of Professor Ramirez, but it's hopefully will initiate a conversation. I know Deborah from way back, and I respect her work very much. But I think that there is disconnect between the government's talk and the government's actions. And for me, that creates a very big problem and a very big, quite a lot of skepticism about community policing unless we can put some things in order. And then finally, and I'm not going to go into detail on this third point, but I just wanted to bring it up. There's a fine line between unlawful homegrown terrorism and lawful offensive political speech. And we need to be very careful if we care about our First Amendment rights, your First Amendment rights, not Muslims, just Muslims' First Amendment, because we all know why the First Amendment was passed. It's so that people in power couldn't essentially oppress people who didn't agree with them and then have power indefinitely or hold on to power indefinitely. So you've got this kind of what I call the Muslims-only homegrown terrorism club after 9/11, and there are a few things that have resulted from that. So the first is the King hearings, which I'm not sure if you all are familiar with them, but he's had, I believe, 3 now, and they are focused exclusively on Muslim terrorism. He does not talk about anything else, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about what he said in the next slide. The other is the NYPD radicalization report, and then there is the third jihad, which is the training that law enforcement has. And I've got to figure out a way to get a clip because I've heard it is quite gruesome, and I think even as a Muslim, if I saw it, I would probably think all Muslims were terrorists too if I saw that. Because I've heard it's just blood and guts everywhere. And that's how they train law enforcement about Muslims, about terrorism in America, and about this threat. So here's what King had to say. Excuse my facetious parenthetical there. But that's what, I mean, come on, it's the white elephant in the room, right? So when somebody critiqued him, many people critiqued him and said, why are you just focusing on Muslims? Some of us were alive before 9/11. Some of us were alive before 1993 when there was another World Trade Center attack by terrorists who were Muslims. Well, he says, to include other groups such as neo-Nazis and extreme environmentalists in this hearing would be extraneous and diffuse its efficacy. It would also send the false message that our committee believes there is any threat equivalency between these disparate groups and Islamist terrorism. Very simply, the committee cannot ignore the fact that al-Qaeda is actively attempting to recruit individuals living within the Muslim American community to commit acts of terror. I will not allow political correctness to obscure a real and dangerous threat to the safety and security of the citizens of the United States. Sounds quite plausible and feasible, but we've got to look at the data, right? I mean, that all sounds, that's what you call a conclusory statement, and a judge says, counselor, I need to see the evidence. You can say, we can all make a bunch of conclusions that are in the interest, in his case, I guess it's his political agenda as opposed to a particular client. Well, I don't know, how many of you all have heard of these guys? Joseph Stack, yeah, flew an airplane into the IRS based on his anti-tax political beliefs. He had a political agenda. He sought to impact policy. He was not just, you know, I just feel like flying a plane into the IRS for no reason. James Cunningham, FBI went to his house, saw him dead. His wife had shot him in self-defense. She didn't get prosecuted because he was beating her. And it turns out he is a rampant neo-Nazi and loved Adolf Hitler. He was all over his house, and he was building a dirty bomb. And he had quite a few dangerous chemicals that he'd ordered from pharmaceuticals, but no one had reported it because his name was James Cunningham. It wasn't Muhammad Yusuf. And the FBI admitted they knew nothing about it until the wife killed him. So we have to thank the wife for many, you know. Thank you, wife. Okay, Jared Lee Loughner. Probably pretty established he's mentally ill. He has a mental health problem. A lot of terrorists have mental health problems. You know, depends on how extreme. He shot and almost killed a congresswoman. He shot a judge and killed him. 6 or 7 other people died. Was he a terrorist? I mean, there wasn't a lot of information about the case. In the court of public opinion, if his name had been Muhammad, there would have been no question. Now, maybe lawyers would have stepped back and said, wait a minute, does this fall into the elements of what a terrorism attack is, or is this just what you call a shooting spree, which we as Americans tend to have a long tradition of? But it's not terrorism, that's just that special American shooting spree tradition. I think they call it going postal. So we can, I mean, I think reasonable minds can disagree as to him. The abortion clinic bombers, I don't know how anyone can can disagree that that's not terrorism. There's definitely an agenda. They're trying to influence, the terrorize civilians, and they're trying to influence government policy, i.e. make it unlawful for women to have abortions. Excuse me, that's supposed to be white militia groups, not WILE. I was typing very fast. But they're primarily Anglo. They've got a lot of guns, and they have a very strong anti-government ideology, and they think that it is their right to stand up and rebel against the government, and if they have to, they will. Patriot groups, which I think is a conglomeration of anti-government groups, and I'll go into details. Anyone know what a sovereign citizen is? So I didn't know what I had heard of them, and then I went to speak at Gonzaga in Spokane, Washington, and I was sitting next to a state judge, and she was telling me about these groups, and they're quite a problem, quite a nuisance for them. And actually, it's not a nuisance because they've killed, I think, 6 officers since 2000, 6 law enforcement officers, not just in Spokane. But they think that the federal government, the state government is illegitimate. They believe that they don't have to pay taxes. They believe that when the American government went off the gold standard, it essentially lost its legitimacy, and that paper money is paper. It's nothing. It's worthless. And so when someone arrests them for speeding, they say, you have no authority, I'm a sovereign citizen. And they're kind of like lone wolf. They're not very networked. And then, of course, we have the crazy Norwegian guy who's a terrorist because he killed, I believe, 68 teenagers. First he killed 8 people, then he killed 68 teenagers and himself, and he cited Robert Spencer. Was it Robert Spencer, I believe, or was it... one of our wonderful misinformation terrorist experts. Yes, it was Robert Spencer. I'll get to that in a minute. Okay. Why did I keep doing that? Sorry. Okay. So Southern Poverty Law Center is a pretty good source. They've been around for a long time. They used to focus a lot on hate groups against African Americans and Jewish Americans. They still do that and do a good job at it, and now they include anti-Muslim bias or hate groups against Muslims. And so this is what they're showing. Since our first African-American president, Barack Hussein Obama, was elected, we have a huge jump in these patriot groups who hate him. They think he's a Muslim, because you can't be Muslim and be president. I thought it's in the Constitution somewhere. And they also think that he's illegitimate. So 149 in 2008, 1,274 in 2011. Many of them have attempted assassination attempts against the United States president. That's pretty serious terrorism acts there. Do we hear about it in the media? No. Now, maybe we're not supposed to, maybe because I know that there is a whole strategy of not highlighting gangsters' activities or certain activities to give them the publicity they want, but the point is it's an issue. And then this is the sovereign citizens. They've killed 6 law enforcement officers since 2000, and that's how many, that's their numbers. Okay, this is essentially what David spoke about, which is the wonderful terrorist report. So the homegrown terrorism that Muslims committed. So if you see the numbers, I mean, I am not in any way underestimating the importance of this. One terrorist attack, as we saw, can kill thousands of people, if not more. But we also have to keep things in perspective so that we use our limited resources wisely, and we make sure that we don't focus on this group while this group kills us. Because once you're dead, you're dead. It doesn't matter who did it. So compared to 14,000 murders in 2011. Okay, this is our Joseph Stack. I thought I would just put this on here because some of you might think that I'm over-exaggerating in identifying him or categorizing him as a terrorist. By the way, he killed one IRS employee who was a veteran. The reason he didn't kill more, I don't know if you all remember, but it was huge smoke was coming up in Austin, and everyone was like, oh, the Muslims have attacked Austin, Texas. And I told them, they don't care about Austin, Texas. They're probably going to go somewhere else. But, sorry, that was my facetious response. So the reason he didn't kill more people is because it was lunchtime on a Friday. So it definitely was at risk of more. I know I'm hardly the first one to decide. I've had all I can stand. It has always been a myth that people have stopped dying for their freedom in this country. And it isn't limited to the blacks and poor immigrants. I know there have been countless before me, and there are sure to be as many after. But I also know that by not adding my body to the count, I ensure nothing will change. I choose to keep not looking over my shoulder at Big Brother while he strips my carcass. I choose not to ignore what is going on all around me. I choose not to pretend that business as usual won't continue. I have just had enough. Well, Mr. Big Brother IRS man, let's try something different. Take my pound of flesh and sleep well. If you took that and changed, put a little bit of Al-Qaeda in there, a little bit of Muslim in there, and change his name to Muhammad Yusuf, would we have a discussion whether he was a homegrown terrorist? No. And there was a big debate as to whether he was. And those who called him a homegrown terrorist got attacked for it and said, no, no, that doesn't count. Okay, this is Anders Breivik, and I just wanted to point, he's a self-described Christian conservative. So I would like to propose that we go and we surveil all churches that have anything to do with his ideology. If he identified himself as a Lutheran, I say we go into all the Lutheran churches and do what the NYPD did. I propose that we go to all the student groups that are Christian Lutheran student groups, and we keep an eye on them. Because you never know who's going to read his 1,500-page manifesto and decide that they're going to attack a bunch of teenagers or who knows what. That's ridiculous, right? So let's think, usually when I speak to audiences and I say, what if we did it to something you're familiar with or a group you would fit into? You see how that sounds, that just doesn't sound rational, and it sounds very exaggerated. But Robert Spencer, one of our favorite friends, who I'm sure will one day do a piece on me, which will mean that I actually am important, he does these hit pieces on a lot of Muslim Americans, and he loves to go after those who discuss the issues I discuss. It's how you know that you're on the A team. Okay. So, but Professor Aziz, you are in denial because Muslims, they support them, even if they don't tell you. It's secret. Some people, this is a Gallup poll in 2010. I'm not going to have a discussion as to whether it's credible or not. I'm just going to assume that Gallup has a reputation to preserve and they're not going to put out baloney statistics. I'm sure it's not perfect because no poll is perfect. Some people, this is the question, some people think that for the military to target and kill civilians is sometimes justified, while others think that kind of violence is never justified. Which is your opinion? Muslims said 78% never justified for the military to kill civilians. 21%, it depends. Protestants, 38% said sometimes never justified. 58% said sometimes it is. Catholic, 39%. You can see the numbers. Now let's get to private citizens, individuals killing civilians. So terrorism. Some people think that for an individual person or a small group of persons to target and kill civilians is sometimes justified, while others think that kind of violence is never justified. Muslims said 89% not justified, never justified. 11% said sometimes. So let's see, who should we be going after? It looks like the Catholics and the Protestants. Those are the ones that are raising my eyebrows. I'm a bit suspicious of them. So, I mean, I apologize for being facetious, but sometimes I just can't help it because the data shows otherwise. I can find 1, 2, 3, 10, 20 people in any demographic that have done something wrong and bad, and I can just essentially associate guilt on everyone who shares those characteristics. That's intellectually lazy. It really is. Okay. So just quickly, this is the NYPD report. I just wanted to show you this is what they're teaching the NYPD to do. As you know, the NYPD sets, it's kind of its own little FBI, and they set a precedent for a lot of local police departments, and this is what they tell their police officers to look out for radicalization. The more orthodox you get, the more suspicious you are. So I'm not sure how that impacts religious freedom, but I assume not in a very good way. Then the CIA, we can't really figure out just how much of a partnership there is between the NYPD and CIA, but there's certainly some records of either current agents or former agents working with them and sending mosque crawlers into mosques to fish. No individualized suspicion, no predicate act. They're not following a suspect. They're just casting a wide dragnet. Would you go to your house of worship and feel comfortable and feel safe and feel like you could pray openly and freely if you felt that there were informants infiltrating it, listening to everything that was said by the sermon, any questions you had of your religious leader? Okay, now with the community policing. This is my problem in a nutshell. The government talks, actually President Obama in particular, you can't ever blame him for his oratory skills, and he hires people who are also good talkers. They talk a really good game. But when you look at their actions, it's very adversarial. And it's not surprising because we have an adversarial process. That's what we have, a defense attorney and a prosecutor. And as David showed in his slide, there is the one way of doing it, the law enforcement way and the community policing way. The law enforcement way is the dominant way. The community policing way is the public relations, to smooth over and diffuse the grievances from the law enforcement. So you've got AUSAs that I know, I won't name any names, who are at community outreach tables and also prosecuting people who are connected to these people at community outreach. In Boston, you know who I'm talking about. Abusive informant tactics. People are essentially being prosecuted for false statements if they won't be informants. And the FBI goes and asks for voluntary interviews. People say, yes, they want to be good Samaritans. They lie about some stupid thing. They shouldn't lie, but I don't think you should go to jail 5 years for lying. And they don't lie about terrorism-related issues. They're lying about something like, oh, I traveled or I didn't travel, or I, sold this or didn't sell that, or I made this much money or I didn't. And then they catch them on that and say, so we can make this all go away, or we can make your life hell. But if you want to make it go away, you be our informant. And that's in addition to just shady informants. All right, I have to kind of go through this quickly. This is just to state the obvious. Women are always kept out of the picture. I have a piece if you're interested in understanding the impact on Muslim women of post 9/11 stereotypes. It's called From the Oppressed to the Terrorist. American Muslim women caught in the dragnet, in the crosshairs of intersectionality. It's coming out in the Hastings Race and Poverty Journal. And this is what's essentially happening in the backdrop, is they're being racialized. So they're the terrorist other. Once you can do that and convince the public that they're intrinsically terrorist and violent, you can get away with a lot in terms of how you enforce homegrown terrorism. 9 years after 9/11, 49% of Americans held an unfavorable view of Islam, 10% higher than 2002. You would think the numbers would be reversed. I think that the government's actions have something to do with it. A lot of people think that Muslims, 92% of them, so the question is, now thinking specifically about Muslims, do you think each of the following applies or does not apply to Muslims living in this country? Muslims living in this country are sympathetic to al-Qaeda. So 56% of Protestants say no, not sympathetic, Catholics 63%, etc. This was an ad in a restaurant in Texas last fall, not 20 years ago, not during the oil crisis in the 70s. Not that this justified that. This is a case, you got to look back in history. I think a lot of it resembles what happened to the Japanese. Some would argue maybe it's worse, although we didn't get interned, thank God. There was some talk about it. But this is Justice Murphy talking about what led to laws that confiscated the land of Japanese while they were interned because they couldn't be citizens because our laws made it illegal for any Asian to be a citizen even if they'd been here for 80 years. If you were born here, yes, but not if you'd immigrated. So is this happening today? Some people would say yes, but I'm just making the point that it's happened before. And then the reason why I care about it, I do national security and civil rights law, I do the intersection, is because you can look this up, it's called Sticks and Stones, The Wars That Hurt, in the New York City Law Review. That's all about how post 9/11 employment discrimination against Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians has skyrocketed. You've got 264 or more mosque vandalizations or threats against mosques or attacks against people at mosques since 9/11. You can look it up at theamericanmuslim.org. Every single incident has a news article link, so you can corroborate it. Do I need to fear taking my young children to the mosque? I hope not, but when you see these numbers, you can't help it. Just in case you think I'm special, I'm not. My law professor position does not protect me. It actually exposes me more. I hope no one sends me a nasty gram after this one. I got these after I spoke at a 9/11 10th anniversary civil rights conference sponsored by the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. I had the uncomfortable position of having to call Tom Perez's people and say, excuse me, but this is the reward that I got for coming and speaking about these issues. Now, they were great. The Civil Rights Division, I respect them a lot. And so finally, this is the ultimate outcome. A lot of Muslims feel it's harder, and this is just the obvious. If we do the us versus them, not only is it divisive for our country and it's got major legal implications, but you're doing a kind of big favor. They want you to do it. So if only out of self-interest, if you don't want to hear the whining about civil rights complaints and the race baiting and all these complaints by these minorities, I'm being, again, facetious, do it in self-interest. So thank you very much.
You have slides?
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much for inviting me to speak here today. Thank you especially to Charlie and Lenz and David for moderating. And I was just told to really speed it up. So I'm going to talk very fast because I have a lot of ground to cover. And the topic today that I'd like to cover is specifically one area of surveillance. We've been talking a lot about surveillance and law enforcement, local law enforcement partnering. And so I wanted to talk about biometric ID cyber surveillance. And what is biometric ID cyber surveillance? And let me just back up and give a little bit of a background. I started in the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice on September 10th, 2001, and so the next day was the terrorist attacks. I immediately started working on immigration-related discrimination, and by 2006 I was promoted to a senior-level management position that coordinated immigration policy for the Civil Rights Division. And what led me to this topic is that over the course of the next few years, after 2001, we saw that a lot of immigration policy was conflating with national security policy. And one of the areas in which the government was trying to move forward with a policy that they thought was very efficacious was relying more on database-driven programs, and specifically biometric database-driven programs. And so what is biometric data? A lot of us understand biometric data to include fingerprints, for example, digital photos, DNA samples, iris retinal scans, but it also includes voice recognition software, digital signature software recognition, and skeletal bone scans. And so one of the trends in biometric cyber surveillance policy is moving towards these biometric ID cards that are digitalized and are able to create a methodology for identity verification through these cards. And what I hope to touch upon today is a little bit about how these biometric ID cards are now facilitating a move towards pre-crime and pre-terrorism programs in which predictive analytics and statistical algorithms are being used in order to try to attempt to stop the crime or the terrorism before it begins through predictive analytics. I doubt we're going to get to constitutional consequences, but just think about some of the constitutional consequences of some of these technologies. So I wanted to talk about, so traditionally, surveillance has included surveillance of the body, being followed, beepers, et cetera, surveillance of the biography, which has included the census statistics, alien registration cards, passports, et cetera. Under modern surveillance, however, you're seeing a convergence of these two types of surveillance methodologies in one technique, which is, like I said, biometric ID cards. And what's also different about surveillance now as it was executed in the past is it's 24/7 now cyber surveillance of the body through GPS tracking, RFID tracking, which is radio frequency identification tracking. And it's also very different in the data surveillance capacities with technology now. It's really a 360-degree data valence of the biography. And this has raised a lot of cases recently before the Supreme Court where I know a lot of you know about the U.S. v. Jones case, the GPS tracking case, but there have been a lot of other cases, Nassau v. Nelson, for example, and immigration-related cases that increasingly utilize these database-driven technologies. And the parties that bring these cases often try to bring them under a Fourth Amendment privacy theory, or increasingly a preemption or federalism theory to protect against states that are utilizing these type of database-driven technologies to sort out criminals or delegate these immigration screening responsibility to the state and local law enforcement. So countering homegrown terrorism, as we've mentioned already, is not a new phenomenon. And in the past, we have used database technologies for national security purposes. The holorith machines that were developed in the 1880s were developed in order to help sort out the US Census statistics, and that was the precursor to the machine that became the IBM computer. And the holorith machines and this database sorting technology was used to round up the Japanese after World War II for internment purposes. Over 110,000 were interned. And the US Census Bureau has now admitted that they used the US Census statistics to also identify Arab Americans after 9/11. Also during World War II and in the run-up to World War II, there was an increasing reliance on alien registration cards as a form of national security policy. The Alien Registration Act of 1940 implemented the fingerprinting of 5 million immigrants during World War II, and also over 600,000 Italian-born and over 300,000 German-born United States residents and their families were required to carry certificates of identification. So soon after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, I'm sure many of you know that there were increased calls to create a national identification database to secure the border, and part of that strategy included implementing some type of biometric national ID card, or having a high-tech social security card, high-tech driver's license, high-tech passport, et cetera. On the DHS website, it explains that there was that recommendation also included in the 9/11 Commission report, and also it started to be elevated to the White House level, where there was increased emphasis on the need for biometric data collection and some type of strategy for implementing this type of data collection and aggregation and analysis for national security purposes across the board, across all federal agencies, state agencies, the military, and the private sector. So multiple Homeland Security presidential directives and national security presidential directives were signed under the Bush administration after 9/11 to facilitate this type of biometric data collection and cyber surveillance. Those include HSPD 6, HSPD 11, HSPD 12. I'm going to just run really fast through all this because I'm trying to get through my slides. But HSPD 12 is particularly noteworthy because it created a biometric ID card for federal government employees and contractors, and it could be the programmatic or technological prototype for a biometric national ID card if and when Congress decides to implement it for all US citizens and those residing in the United States lawfully. There's also another Homeland Security presidential directive and National Security presidential directive, NSPD 59 and HSPD 24, that's titled Biometrics for Identification and Screening to Enhance National Security. It was signed by President Bush on June 5th, 2008. And this is the one that is particularly very interesting because it directs the military and federal government to collect, store, use, analyze, and share biometrics. And it directs the military and federal government to gather contextual information. And I'll be talking a little bit more about contextual information in a second. And it also creates the foundation for the FBI's Next Generation Identification Project, which I don't know whether, I'm sure many of you have already heard about, but it creates an interoperable, centralized biometric database for the government, and it's due to be rolled out in 2013. So HSPD 12, as I explained, is the presidential directive that led to the creation of this biometric ID card for federal government workers and contractors, and it became the basis for the challenge in NASA v. Nelson, where they were claiming that it led to a constitutional violation of their right to privacy, informational privacy specifically, but it's a card that allows for I know many of you probably have one, but allows for the recording of the entry and exit points of an employee. It has a circuit chip on it that embeds personal identification on it, as well as biometric information. In this case, it has a digital photograph, as well as it has fingerprints. It's machine readable, and what that means is by creating a machine readable ID card, it allows for a tool for data aggregation analysis, and so it's very different from a paper-based card, which is a lot of the identification systems that we've been using previously. And then it created also this HSPD 12 program, a mandate that every federal agency was directed to develop a background check and a credentialing program. And so even though it didn't crystallize into a live claim before the Supreme Court, when it went up to the Supreme Court, the decision was issued last year, these were some of the suitability criteria that was issued by NASA in order to receive the biometric ID card. So as you can see, drunk, bad check, minor traffic violation, attitude and personality conflict. There was a lot involved in a 96-page desk guide in determining the suitability criteria before the ID was given. And I wanted to go back to this issue of contextual information because I think it helps to explain a little bit why there was this level of detailed criteria before the HSPD 12 card was issued to these NASA contractors who challenged the law. The HSPD 24 and NSPD 59, like I said, requires contextual information to be gathered. Well, what is contextual information? According to one high-tech executive, contextual information includes all locations that you go, all the purchases you ever make, all of your relationships, all of your activities, all of your health, governmental, employer, academic, financial records, all of your web search history, your calendars, your appointments, your phone calls, your data, your texts, your email, all people connected to your social circle, all of your personal interests, all of your other personal data. So it's casts quite a wide net for contextual information. So what's also different about these biometric ID cards is it's not only a data surveillance tool, but it's also a cyber surveillance tool. Since 2005, many driver's licenses are now embedded with RFID chips, and all US passports since 2007 are embedded with these RFID chips, and many experts note that RFID and GPS technologies are starting to merge. And so what this will allow is for an ability to use identification cards as a surveillance tracking tool. And what's also being researched is the way that these identification cards are being used not only for physical access restriction, but logical access restriction, which means these cards are being used to limit access to internet, computer use, vehicles, et cetera, anything that can be key to an ID card as a matter of security. And so what is the likelihood that we're going to get a digital biometric ID card? Well, comprehensive immigration reform proposals recently have included requirements that we implement some type of biometric ID. A high-tech social security card has been the most recent manifestation of this idea. But the Legal Workforce Act of 2011, under a mandate of E-Verify, would just delegate to the Department of Homeland Security the responsibility to determine what type of biometric data would be required for an identification suitable to demonstrate lawful presence and work authorization in this country. Because we need to leave some time for questions, I'm just going to stop there, but I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you. I think we're going to alternate side by side, so please catch the attention of the microphone holders, and we'll get your questions.
Hi, my name is Richard Ellman. I'm retired, live in Durham. I think this would be directed more to Sahar than the others, but do you think that the Muslim community, the good Muslim community, is speaking out forcefully enough to condemn terrorist acts, Muslim terrorist acts?
Right. So I get this question a lot. So I have two responses to it. One of them is my staunch American individualist side speaking, and one of them is answering your question. The first response is I take issue with any community having to apologize for the bad acts of a few members of their community. I don't expect it of Jews, I don't expect it of Christians, I don't expect it of whites, I don't expect it of blacks. I think that it perpetuates a guilt by association. It perpetuates that narrative. So that's the first response I have is, why should they have to do that? But we live in the real world. So And there are real consequences for them not doing it. So it may be that they should do it for practical reasons. Yes, they do. Those who, if you look at every advocacy organization, they issue press releases ad nauseum. If you look at a lot of mosques, now some mosques are really small and they're pretty much volunteer organizations, so they don't even have the capacity to do, PR. But it's not getting in the media. And that's really the disconnect, is a lot of people, the media does not cover things that are not, bloody, gory. I mean, we know the story about what attracts media attention. So part of it is just not coverage, but if you look at all the mainstream groups, if you look at all the groups who are active, yeah, they've condemned it. Do they condemn every single act? I don't know, probably not, but then it goes back to the original issue is that something that we think we should expect? And if we do, I think we have to be consistent. Then we should expect it from everyone. If a veteran commits a terrorist act, I think veterans groups need to stand up and say, this does not represent veterans. We've got to be consistent, or else you're falling prey to disparate treatment, and that perpetuates a lot of other problems.
So I speak a lot on this topic, and this question is always asked, and there's usually a Muslim American on the panel, and it is uniform that the Muslim American feels that they have made statements, apologized, condemned, till they're blue in the face. So it's a very interesting phenomenon that much of mainstream America feels that there haven't been enough statements, and most Muslim Americans feel that they've been apologizing, condemning ad nauseum. So it's an interesting phenomenon because different parts of our population are experiencing this issue differently. And we can try to ask ourselves why that is. I don't have good solutions. But one thing I can say is that my colleague Charles Kurzman, who was the co-author of these reports, if you look at his personal website, he's a professor at UNC, he has a compilation of statements by Muslim American groups that runs over 100 pages. And that's just the citation, the collection of citations of such statements. So you can look at that for yourself. More questions? I think we're going to this side now. Ambassador Litt. On the bottom.
There he is. Okay. David Litt from the Institute for Defense and Business in Chapel Hill. I want to flip that question around. Since one of the motivations of violent extremist groups, especially those that have a conspiratorial narrative, is to generate paranoia, to confirm the narrative, and to get people to act on such things. So what might be some of the probably community-based strategies to undermine the ability to generate, to perpetuate the conspiracy theory?
Debbie? And I'll take
Okay. Well, first, it is hard to know what to say to the community about why.
Speak into your microphone a little more, Debbie. I think you got to lean forward.
Turn it on from the bottom.
I don't know. Does it work? I think what I said in my presentation is true, and I'm not sure why it is true. But Muslims, Arabs, and Sikhs have lost the battle in the arena of public opinion. And that is an important problem that we need to address, because that is one of the driving forces for the hate crimes, the hate incidents, and the discrimination. And when people question, and this was done at the King hearings, why is the Muslim community not speaking out against terrorism was one of the themes of that hearing. And then you go to any site, and you could go there today to the Adams Mosque, which is one of the largest mosques, to CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, to the Muslim Public Affairs Council, to the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, to the Arab American Institute, and on and on. If you went to any Muslim or Arab website, there are many, many, many denunciations of terrorism. So how do we address this problem if the groups are already condemning it, but that message is not heard in the arena of public opinion? And one of the students in my class, I teach a national security class, said, "I know we are hated," she's Muslim, "but how do we become unhated? And how have other groups like Jews, like gays, like lesbians, like blacks, like Latinos, how have they become unhated? What do we need to do for America to see us as something other than suspects or terrorists?" And that is a complicated question, and I do have two suggestions. One thing is, I think that if the community were to decide to participate in these community-based partnerships, that would help them to recast their role. And that would be a partial help. But I do agree, because we don't yet have any infrastructure or architecture, that the community is right to say, what are you talking about partnerships? It's a very adversarial relationship out there, because we have not yet developed what the partnership model, which is in its baby stages. We only got a policy statement from Obama in August of 2011, and we haven't built a model yet. The second thing is, I think that the war has to be fought with the media. And this is not your problem, but it's the way the American media portrays things. And I have been trying to get a documentary filmmaker to do a documentary about this issue. I don't know what you call it, Islamophobia, hate, but why is this population demonized in the press, and what do we, all of us as Americans, do about that? It's not good for us. It's not our best selves. It's not who we are. It's not who we aspire to be. But there is a lot of hate mongering, and not just against Muslims, in the dominant press. And I'm not going to mention the stations, but you know you can turn on the TV and you hear it. And a big question is what you do about it.
I don't think that was your question, though. Your question was, how do you stop a small but potentially dangerous population of individuals who find this extremist ideology attractive, and how do you prevent them from going down that path towards violence? And, no. Okay, well, maybe we need to talk about it at lunch. Let's get another question. Yeah.
Everyone can hear me. Probably Margaret and Deborah probably already know I'm going to ask something along these lines, but I'd like the panelists to possibly comment on their reaction to violence and violent extremism among the groups, Muslim on Muslim, and other violent extremism and violence black on black, and how you reconcile that in relation to the things you spoke about today.
I think that it shows that, for one, the way I reconcile it is it corroborates what I've always thought is it's really politically driven violence, because there is a big segment of the population, and I'm sure including in the government law enforcement, who think it's part of the religious ideology. And that's not, look, I can look up any holy book and find something that says go out and kill someone. So that again, I think is an intellectually lazy approach and not a serious one. But as far as why are they doing that? Yes, they're going to use the rhetoric of religion because it's a lot more powerful. And you can get people to do a lot of things when you say God, when you put God in the sentence. I don't care what religion you follow. But it shows that it's political. Because if they're killing each other, and most religions, including Islam, say don't kill other Muslims. Of course, then they'll say, well, you're a kafir. Okay, now I'm going to kill you. A kafir is a disbeliever, and part of that they abuse that concept. So I think for Muslims, I can't talk. I mean, I think that black-on-black crime is very different. You're in a very different context. The Muslim-on-Muslim violence abroad is because it's political parties that are fighting with each other. Bhutto got assassinated by people who didn't want her to be the president of Pakistan. The Taliban is fighting the Northeast frontier people, before we went in. I mean, it's political. These are, unfortunately, they're, instead of being in a court of law, for example, battling out who won the presidency in 2000, they're shooting each other and killing each other and using terrorism because they don't have a military, they don't have guns. I mean, terrorism is a tool for asymmetrical warfare when you don't have those kind of traditional military tools. So that's how I explain that, and I think it just, again, feeds into the fact that it's not as much religion as it is politics.
Go up to this side. Do you have a question? Somebody?
Sarah's question.
I have one here. Professor Hu, this is Sarah Beal. Would you like to talk about the constitutional implications of the data that you put up?
Well, I think that this type of new era of data mining, database-driven technologies, and biometric data in particular open a whole host of challenges that are yet to be understood as far as whether our Constitution and our judicial system is prepared to be able to sort out when is it justified as a national security policy and when is it a violation of the Fourth Amendment, for example. The U.S. v. Jones case with the GPS tracking raised a lot of issues of, is it an unreasonable search and seizure of data, for example, whether or not you really can use a trespass in tort doctrine in order to, defend against a GPS, type of device. And I think the DNA evidence that's gathered, if it were mandated as a part of a biometric ID card, and fingerprints as well, because of the way that it would implicate criminal investigations, I think would open a lot of...
Do you think you'll support the amendment?
Actually, I think that it potentially could undermine the entire Bill of Rights. I think that ultimately, I think what could really happen is you have a situation where people are presumed to be guilty until proven as innocent, based on statistical algorithms and conclusions based on database information alone. And I think that we're already seeing that with the government trying to create a no-fly list, a no-vote list, a no-work list, and it's making it very difficult for people to be able to confront those databases if they're faulty, or what is the statistical algorithm that led to that decision. And so, I think there's a lot of huge implications to our Constitution.
Okay.
I just wanted to support one thing about Margaret's statement is I think what's really important about Margaret's work is she's showing what ends up happening to everybody when we focus on one particular group, because a lot of these laws and policies and presidential directives were issued under this whole response to 9/11 and under the war on terror, and everybody's minds kept thinking, okay, these terrorists that I talked about, the terrorist other. But as her research shows, it's going to affect all of us, and it's very difficult, as we know, to reverse laws once they're passed. So I just wanted to, I think it's very related.
Okay. You've already had a question, so let me get to Colonel Brennan.
I'll just, before we go to the microphone, response to your last answer, Margaret, the biometric data, we've used it extensively in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's actually helped us immensely because we're using that data for the criminal population. We don't care what the demographic is. The criminals we're trying to put in jail, and the innocent people we're trying to protect. So that data also helps, does it not help keep the wrong guy from going to jail? Throw it out there.
I think that that's the main argument in favor of increasing the biometric databases, that once you have a more comprehensive universal biometric database, then you're able to then sort out people and claim that they're innocent. They're able to, the Innocence Project, for example, being able to use biometric data to defend themselves, or use the biometric data, as you say, to prosecute individuals that need to be investigated and prosecuted. But I think that what's really important to understand about biometric identification verification on a mass scale involving millions of people, is that the National Academy of Sciences said that the technology simply does not exist. So if you're looking at a case-by-case individual basis with a human expert trying to match that biometric data, that's one thing. When you're trying to collect 300 million fingerprints and DNA samples from the US population and trying to create a machine swipeable card and say you can only vote if your DNA matches or your fingerprints match with this card, they said that that's pure science fiction, that that doesn't work.
Okay, Charlie has given us one more question before lunch, so somebody out there want to? Okay.
This question is for Deborah, I think, primarily, but certainly anyone can feel free to opine. I'm Tom Leary from the Navy, and during your remarks, it struck me as very much like counterinsurgency strategy applied overseas. And I'm wondering if there's any dialogue between the military and the folks that are working your community engagement issue on applying some of those key lessons learned that we have made over 10 difficult years of trying to implement that strategy.
I know that if we were to have a national center, that would be part of the component, that we need to capture some of the lessons learned there, some of the lessons learned in the UK, some of the lessons learned prior to 9/11, and that certainly is an excellent suggestion and one that has been made. And hopefully if we ever have a national center, it will have applications beyond just this situation.
Can I just make one comment? I think a key component or a key factor in the success of community policing is to create an incentive structure where law enforcement is rewarded for using, for example, a rehabilitative model instead of the punitive adversarial model. Because the way it works now is prosecutors are rewarded by how many how many indictments they file, how many investigations they open. And that's the criteria. As long as that's the criteria, that is going to drive an adversarial process. As long as that happens, I'm going to tell my clients, don't you dare talk to the FBI without an attorney. But if you can make it where you get rewarded for saying, well, we found this kid, he was really lost, was confused, his parents came to talk to us, and we managed to get him in some treatment center because it turns out he's schizophrenic, and we didn't prosecute the parents for lying to us because they were protecting their son, and we didn't just put him away for 20 years. That, I think, you've got to do that if you want the contradiction to go away.
Well, thank you very much. I think we had a terrific panel. In fact, both panels this morning were beyond my expectations, and what a terrific panel that we had. Very provocative. Let's give them a hand.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.